Hi, I'm Rebecca Christopher, and on behalf of all of my colleagues here at Invariant, I'm pleased to welcome you to our 13th Dialogue for Change. Dialogue for Change is Invariant's series focusing on critical conversations about racial injustice and inequality and the actions we can take to influence change in the public and private sectors. Through our series, we'll ask, what can CEOs, employees, and individuals do to enact change? Today's discussion is about a topic I've spent most of my career working on, helping eligible voters make their voices heard in elections by casting their ballots successfully, safely, confidently, and on time. While getting out the vote, or GOTV, is still a main activity of campaigns, candidates, and parties, promoting democracy and civic engagement is increasingly seen as a responsibility shared by those inside and outside of the political realm. More and more consumers expect the brands they support to step up and support voting on and before Election Day. The benefits to companies are straightforward. A 2022 study by Morning Consult found that giving employees time off to vote, advocating for safe and fair elections, and assisting organizations advancing voter access all boost a company's employer brand for most Americans. Getting involved in voter registration efforts drove overall favorability as well as intent to purchase. Companies can often bring resources to the table that nonprofits, campaigns, and even government lack. They can communicate with Americans who may be frustrated with partisan political communication and those who are unreachable by campaigns and parties. However, with deadlines, processes, requirements, and options varying state to state and election to election, the possibility for error and presenting a potential voter with inaccurate information is high. It's increasingly difficult for companies to build their own tools without risk. So in order to successfully encourage voting internally and externally, companies now have a variety of tools to choose from and can build voter engagement programs that provide accurate information and tools that function nationwide with relatively little effort. Today, we'll have a discussion with panelists who represent the most sophisticated voter engagement platforms available and who have managed programs for America's biggest brands. This conversation will touch on the state of voter engagement, best practices, and how to get started for companies who are new to GOTV. Our panelists are Sylvia Albert, the Director of Voting and Elections at Common Cause, a nonpartisan grassroots organization. Sylvia works with national staff and Common Cause state offices to press for reforms that expand access to the ballot for eligible voters and promote fair representation in our democracy. Carolyn DeWitt is the President and Executive Director of Rock the Vote, the largest national organization focused on building long-term political power for this country's most diverse youth generation. During her tenure, she's launched Brands for Democracy and developed new partnerships with brands such as Warner Media, Hulu, Sony, Nike, and Levi Strauss. Alex Nimcheski is the CEO and co-founder of Ballot Ready, a voter guide to every race and referendum on the ballot. Ballot Ready fuels efforts by companies and organizations to recruit candidates and inform and turn out voters through a customized digital platform leveraged by Snapchat, the Miami Heat, and NPR affiliates. Kenny Thompson Jr. is the head of external affairs at PepsiCo, the largest food and beverage company in the United States. Kenny's team leads efforts to promote PepsiCo's public policy agenda while strengthening the company's reputation with local communities, legislators, investors, and business leaders. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. To begin our panel, I'd like to ask each of you to share a reflection on the current landscape. Consumer expectations for companies have evolved enormously in recent years, especially expectations for their involvement in elections and voting. Do Americans think brands have a civic duty to boost voter turnout?
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca. I really appreciate it. Absolutely. I think what we know now is that especially the younger generation wants to know what the brands they use represent. They want the brands they use to share their values. And with the internet and kind of social media, you can always find out the answer to whether or not the brand you're using shares your value. And so I think, civic participation and GOTV and engaging in, democracy building is something that everybody can get behind, and it doesn't engage kind of the partisan politics, but allows you to represent your brand to represent just democracy. So I think it's a very powerful way to engage your audience.
Yeah, Sylvia's absolutely right. Obviously Rock the Vote our mission is to build the political power of young people. And we saw this with millennials, but even more so with Gen Z, as we are seeing that both where they work and where they spend their money. They want to see companies stand up for the values that they believe in. So, and take a stand. It's actually in a lot of cases now more risk not to take a stand on issues than it is to actually weigh in and make a statement or have engagement opportunities for employees or for customers, and to create a culture of civic engagement or a culture around the issues that are kind of at the forefront of our country right now. And so particularly from the labor side of things, we see, right, that there is an increasingly important aspect for companies to think about how they're retaining employees and how they're creating a culture where employees feel valued, where their voice feels valued. And this is one way for them to do that. And very similar, as Sylvia said, right, online, they have access to information. So they're looking at where they should be spending their money and what companies, right, they know the value of their money and where they're putting their money in those companies. So, so it's incredibly important from both an employee aspect, but also from a consumer aspect.
I 100% agree with both Carolyn and Sylvia, but there's also research that backs this up. Research shows more and more employees are deciding where to work based on brands' values, and more consumers are deciding where to purchase from based on brands' values. But we also, you probably have seen this anecdotally when you are interviewing someone, then they might mention your civic engagement work. When we work with brands, they often are very excited about all the positive social media posts that people share. So there's research, but it's nice to see the fruits of the labor as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything. It's 100% right across the board, right? Consumers want to see and know what brands stand for outside of selling them a product, right? Like they want to know what value a corporation, what value does the private sector bring to my everyday life other than trying to sell me something, right? So, and as Alex said, we're seeing it increasingly with employee retention and employee recruitment. I mean, I get more questions about, our sustainability platform than I did 6, 7, 8 years ago. So you can just tell by the talent that we're recruiting that this is something that is not going away. It's only getting increasing in the importance of people's day-to-day lives. They want to work for a company or organization that they can be proud of, and they can almost defend when they go out and they're talking to their friends, and so it really matters in a way that I don't think it has in the past.
Thank you so much. Kenny, you've been with PepsiCo through 4 election cycles now. I'd love to hear from you how you've seen expectations, engagement, or outcomes change in that time.
Yeah, 4 cycles, that's wild. Yeah, look, it has changed immensely, right? Like, I sort of alluded to it a second ago. The expectations of the private sector weighing in on social issues has only increased. The expectations of making statements and taking a stand on issues has only increased. And obviously over the course of the past, 2 years, I'd say it's just increased exponentially. Look, particularly in 2020, we've always had a pretty robust voter engagement program at PepsiCo. But I will say in 2020, when it was sort of in disarray, where do I vote? When do I vote? How do I vote? All these questions that our employees were asking outside folks, they were just getting different answers. So we just decided, what? We're a trusted employee. You work here. Let's create a program that lets you know how, when, where to vote. And it's just something that I think is only going to increase with misinformation and laws changing, and everything's happening so quickly. And I don't think a lot of folks have the time to figure out exactly where to vote. So let's make it easy. Let's just make it easier for people to vote, right? Like, it's pretty straightforward. So that's really what I've seen over the course of my tenure here at PepsiCo.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. That definitely seems like as you said, something that's not going away, is something that will only get more important. Alex, Ballot Ready is in the unique position to learn not only from a diverse range of brands' experiences in helping Americans vote, but also educating them about their ballots. Can I ask you how you've seen changes in best practices for how companies can motivate potential voters to vote successfully and confidently based on that experience?
Yeah, so the best practice used to be just register to vote, which is still really important, but it has expanded to include the whole process of voting and voting in more local elections. So registering to vote is obviously important for companies to do, especially since they're so they have unique access to new voters. A lot of employees, especially in the last 2 years, have moved, so they need to re-register. But in the last 2 years, there's, like Kenny said, there's been confusion about actual how to vote, how to sign up to vote by mail, where to drop off your ballot. Many people are doing it for the first time. So what we try to do in response to this is help voters through the entire process, which also includes helping people understand what's going to be on their ballot, even for people who've registered, even for people who are really into politics. They might not be aware of all the offices and all the candidates that are going to be on their ballot. It can be quite overwhelming because we elect a lot of people. So we try to make it easy for folks to understand. The other thing with local elections, there's so many local elections that happen all year round. But before recently, companies didn't have the ability to track all that information because these local elections are run at the local level. So there was no easy avenue for companies to be able to do that, but that's what we do. That's why we exist. And for voters, they know they have this power in local elections, but it's often where they feel the least informed. So like Kenny said, we try to make it super easy for people to understand how to vote, who to vote for in every election possible.
Thank you. Carolyn, when we talk about voting, I think that in-person voting on election day is still the first picture in most people's minds, but the process is so much more expansive than that and occupies so much more time than just election day. What are the major opportunities for a company to engage on voting?
Yeah, so what Alex actually kind of talked about is an interesting thing for people to think about is like, we tend to think about registration as kind of the first step, but oftentimes that's not actually the first step. The first step is actually an education piece of understanding kind of why it's important to then register, why it's important to engage. So even taking kind of a step back from and thinking about the education component of, a lot of us did benefit from civic education, but quite frankly, there's so much civic education that needs to be done, and a lot of us didn't benefit from that. So even things as basic as have education programs for employees or customers that elevate even like the importance of midterm elections. What are midterms, right? Who are we voting for? What are these positions of these people who are on my ballot? So taking a step back of kind of what's at stake in these elections and why it's important to engage first, and how does it impact the issues that you care about? Because a lot of times that's actually what motivates voters. So for companies, there are, right, these education components of what are the opportunities that they can provide and work with a group like Rock the Vote or Common Cause or others, right, to engage in that education process, and where can we point employees or consumers to learn more, or what are the panels, right, that we can put together for them. And then the next step is kind of starting to engage them in that step-by-step process. So the registration process, what are the different ways that I can vote? So yes, there's in-person voting, but now we also have all these flexible voting options. And what do those mean? I mean, there's a lot of confusion we take for granted, I think, in our space of that people understand the difference between absentee voting and in-person voting, or early voting, absentee, in-person voting. And so it is really confusing. And so breaking those down step by step, but also recognizing that individuals themselves have the power to then, once they educate and empower themselves, to empower their friends and family and their community, their own community. So things like, there are now a bunch of civic holidays. So there's National Voter Registration Day that companies can engage on. There's National Voter Education Week, which is the first week of October. There's National Vote Early Day, which is in late October. And then we have the opportunities for employees and customers to serve as poll workers. So there's also, companies can run programs that encourage their employees to take time off to actually poll work. And in some cases, we've seen companies actually pay their employees to serve as poll workers. So there are a lot of different engagement opportunities. They can, run if you want to do in-person voting, you can run some sort of carpool. You could also have different opportunities for ballot parties where they're using, Ballot Ready or Rock the Vote or another platform to educate themselves about who their candidates are. And you can have a ballot party where people come together and share their research. So there are a lot of different engagement opportunities for companies to run for their employees. And of course, there's always like the phone banking, texting banking now that happens where they can engage and help get out their community and folks to vote.
Thank you. Sylvia, now that we've talked about everything that comes before Election Day, what about the day of and beyond? What should companies be thinking about in terms of engagement after the time has run out for registration, early voting, and persuasion?
So I think, as everybody has pointed out, the civic education piece is so important. And that is all of the stuff that happens on the off years when only the small group of people are paying attention, right? What we saw in the last 2 years was actually much more people paying attention in the off years or the odd years. And I think that really enhanced the knowledge of their communities in what is involved in, creating an election system and operating it in a cohesive, accessible way. So, that kind of constant discussion that happens during off years through panels, through whatever other, avenues, I think is really important. Also, I think companies have an opportunity to engage in a way that benefits not just their constituents, not just their employees, but everybody. I think, we all saw in the last couple of years that our election system, unfortunately, isn't that well funded, and it isn't, nimble to be able to change on a dime. And as a result, corporate America has resources that we, as that small town election official doesn't have. And that's not saying give them money, because lots of places that's actually not allowed. But what we saw was a way that corporate America can use what they have to benefit. So I particularly love the move to use arenas as polling locations. And it started, I remember so distinctly getting a call from the Atlanta Hawks, and it started with them, and then it spread, right? And they also, as Rebecca was speaking to, or as I think Carolyn was speaking to, they also they paid their workers normal wage to work as poll workers, right? But that was, a location that wasn't being used. Yes, they had to probably pay for the lights, but it wasn't a huge, it wouldn't be a huge investment to offer a location for election officials to be able to use. And especially considering, lots of polling locations are churches or other older locations that might not be accessible. The community of persons with disabilities really needs the benefit of kind of more modern spaces to be able to have access to the ballot. So that's just one way, but I think thinking outside of the box, do you have warehouses that could house elections equipment because they're empty most of the year? Or could be a place where the canvas and counting of the ballot happens because they need large spaces, right? So these are things that you might have resources that you're not really using at that moment in time that could really be helpful to the elections system as a whole.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I love the idea of using space and thinking creatively to support elections. I have a question now for Kenny, which is, having been on both sides of this conversation, what do you think is the most important lesson companies need to learn about GOTV? For example, how much time and effort does it take to set up a program?
Well, I think what Sylvia said, well, everyone said, is the educational piece is crucial, right? Like that is really where I think the foundation of any sort of GOTV effort starts. You know, why this is important, how this happens, when this happens, and sort of having a repetitive, whether it's panels or reminder emails or whatever the case may be for your company, is to start that process, not the same year as an election, but like before, right? So it can, you know, build up and be on the top of mind for your employees. I was sort of thinking about it as in phases, right? So the educational component, and then the registration component, and then the GOTV component, right? So sort of thinking about it in 3 phases, at least how I've thought about it. I think we get so much more employee engagement when you are consistently talking about it. You get more questions, you get more engagement, you get more folks who want to volunteer, who want to be poll workers, who want to drive folks to the polls. The more they hear about it, the more interested they seem to be to get into it, right? So I think the GOTV piece is obviously critical, but you're much more likely to get more people engaged when you've been talking about the process for a longer period of time than that, you know, 2-month period.
Thank you. Talking to Ballot Ready, Common Cause, and Rock the Vote, you all provide incredible resources and sophisticated tool sets that help companies maximize their impact on democracy. And I know that you all work with companies at every level of experience with getting out the vote and educating voters. What would you recommend as a first step for those who want to begin an election engagement program for the first time?
Just reach out to us. I mean, the reality is we've got tons of election dorks here, and we would absolutely love to dive in and help you figure it out. And we can do most of the work. That's the reality, right? I think the first thing to know is it doesn't have to be too hard of a lift, and we are absolutely ready to take it on. So just reach out to us.
Yeah, I was going to say, reach out to any of our groups. I mean, I think what Kenny said too is very true. And the question, Rebecca, that you asked was, you know, how much work does it actually take? It's really up to you how much work you want to put into it, right? And for some companies, they're ready to dive in and have like a person dedicated to it that's working with one of our organizations. But there's also like, you might want to pilot something. You might want to do something with employees first and see how that goes, and then expand out to your public base, right? You might, it all depends on the company too. So that's one thing that a lot of us think about, and we'll work with whoever reaches out to us, is kind of, what's the company culture? How big are you? Where are you geographically located, right? What makes the most sense for you? How do you talk to your employees? What platforms and mediums do you have to actually get information out? What kind of resources do you have to help support this? And the other thing I would just say is, like, back to the other kind of, I think one of the points you framed early on, Rebecca, was, you know, how has the culture shifted? And something that Sylvia said earlier about how the Hawks started, right, and this arena pick, and then, because we worked with a lot of sports teams, especially in 2020, was the culture has shifted, where now it is a very safe place. Like 5 years ago, you used to have companies come into the space and say, I don't know, it feels like too political to come in. And now it's like, the space is, we have so many companies, there's been a total culture shift where, like, this is, if you are not doing this, like, that's a question actually of why you aren't engaged in this work. But understanding that there are groups like ours who are on here who are happy to welcome you into the space and happy to walk you through so that you are in a safe place, you're not making mistakes, right? And you have the experts who kind of know how to do this work and are going to make sure to protect your brand. I think it's really important to know.
We recently made a couple tools based on our experience with companies, especially in 2020, where the information can feel overwhelming, but so we want to make it super easy for companies to onboard with us. So we have two things. One is an election center, which provides every action a voter can take to get ready to vote, from registering, signing up to vote by mail, learning about their ballot, to volunteering, working the polls. And the second is comms. There are a lot of dates to keep in mind, especially with all these holidays, and you don't have to do that. That's what we can do. So yeah, again, just reach out.
Yeah, I'll just add, it's crucial to have a key partner, right? Like, it's fantastic to have partners who are true experts in this, because there are a lot of questions that I may not know the answer to, or my colleagues may not know the answer to, but there are folks who absolutely live and breathe voting and elections, and to have them as partners is crucial to any sort of voting educational program that you're thinking about running.
And I'll just add that, we don't think you need to be the end all and be all. So if you're worried about approaching us because we are going to say, oh, you have to run a program to, inform all of your constituents, your employees, everything, we're not going to do that, right? Like, we are going to meet you where you want to be. If your base is college aged, well, then we have programs on college campuses and we can help you get in there. Well, really, probably Rock the Vote can help you more, but we've got them too. But we are happy to meet you where you are, and don't think that we are going to overwhelm or shame or anything if you don't have like this gigantic big plan.
That's great to hear. Don't like to be overwhelmed or shamed. Kenny, we have been talking about these programs as if there's already all of this internal buy-in. It's something that everyone is kind of ready to push go on. I would love to hear some of your experience about, or advice to anyone who's trying to gain internal buy-in or make the case internally about why these programs need to happen.
Sure. Yeah, look, it took a little bit to we're a big company, a lot of folks. For us, we have a headquarters in New York, a headquarters in Texas, and the last thing you want for any of these programs is to come across as political in any way, right? So thinking about a strategy in which education is the foundation of what you are trying to accomplish, I think, is key. So thinking about a plan where you are focused on education, and also having those reputable partners who can validate any plan that you or your colleagues put forth, right? So you've got lots of organizations, a lot represented here today, who can help validate the work that you're doing. And look, I think it's really important to, at least for us, to hammer home the educational piece. I mean, everything gets politicized, everything. So how can you turn down the temperature, remind your bosses or your team that this is about employee engagement? This is about civic engagement. This is about making sure that we have an active employee base and they know how to engage in their communities. And it's good for PepsiCo, right? I mean, it's work for your company. You want to be responsive to your employees. Our employees were asking these questions about how to vote, when to vote. I want to get involved. I want to get engaged. Do I get time off to vote? So we have to have answers for those questions, and having answers and also having a partner to support your platform, whatever it may be, is crucial. So I think those are the steps that you should take, and as you think about building any program out. Carolyn mentioned it earlier. You can go piece by piece. It doesn't have to be this gigantic, all-encompassing thing, particularly if you're new to it. So, start off at where you feel comfortable. But I just, always caution that the political winds will always be blowing. So think about how to, for your own sanity, frankly, like keep it as educational base as possible.
I think actually, if I can add to that, Kenny, too, something you had said earlier about, making sure that you're doing this not just in major federal election years, I think also goes to the point of helping to, one, make sure that this is an authentic aspect of your programming, right? That you're not just doing it around federal election years, but that you really care about the local communities in which your employees or consumers live too. So I know some of the partners that we started working with in 2020, we started engaging in local elections last year as well. And then the other component is that helps also turn down the heat on this is a partisan thing, right? Because when you start focusing on all elections, all democracy across the board, it's really about voice and democracy and representation than it is anything else. So
I think that's really helpful advice for all of us on this call. Folks, we have come to the end of the prepared questions in this webinar. If you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. I have a few that have come in through our submission form that I'll go ahead and field to the panelists now. But if you do have a question for us, please feel free to ask it or sit on it until after the webinar is over, and please get in touch with us. So we've talked a little bit about timelines and dates already, but did want to make sure that we asked, is it ever too late to start building a GOTV program? Is there a cutoff point? Is it election day? And I think, Carolyn, maybe we could hear from you on this.
it is never too late. The question just is, what are your expectations of both the partner that you're going to be working with and also the expectations that you have for what you're going to be able to accomplish. So, so it's never too late. That would be my short snippet on that. I mean, even in 2020, for example, like on election day, kind of we were working up and built a ballot tracking and curing tool, for example, where people can track their ballot, like can know where to go to track their ballots and then their local election official information so that there is an issue with their ballot or they had to vote using a provisional ballot. So even as something as like on election day, you're deciding to get involved, you could just share that information out, right, with your employees or on your social channels. So something as simple as that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, like, we know it's better to start earlier, but most voters by far are thinking about stuff on election day. So, call us election night eve and we will have something live for you then. It's okay. We can start with it.
That's great news and really helpful to hear. I had a question that I think might be a great fit for you, Alex, talking about helping folks make a plan, talking about giving people access to these tools. First-party data is obviously very desirable for some companies and organizations, but others, especially really large companies, have a lot of internal restrictions on handling it. Is it possible to facilitate voter registration without touching PII?
Yeah, we do that. The way we work is we like to send voters reminders when they make a plan to vote. So texting them and emailing them. We make data available to anyone, to the partner that we work with, if they want it, to track impact or just to reach out to them again for other social impact things down the road. But we also, as part of that, we delete voters' information from our database after the election because privacy is so important to us. And companies have the option of us never seeing a voter's data at all.
Very interesting and good news. Sorry, Carolyn, to interrupt you.
No, I was going to say that's very similar practices at Rock the Vote too, because what you have too is in some states you have sensitive information, that stuff gets deleted right away, at least the way that we do it. And then basically the partner can either opt in to a partner portal where they have access to everything, to a dashboard with information and the data, and or they could opt not to, and then we work on the tracking for them.
Great. I had a question that, Kenny, you mentioned a little bit of this at the top of the call, and I think that we've all noted that there are distinct trends that don't seem to be reversing themselves, but wondering if there are any predictions that we might make about how the upcoming midterms and upcoming general election might be different in terms of how expectations, how companies can get engaged, anything like that. What predictions can we make about the future?
I think the prediction that I'm making for our company is it's only going to increase. We've sort of alluded to it throughout the call. Employee engagement around this issue has only ticked up since I've been at PepsiCo, and particularly since 16 and 20, right? So we've started already, on our 2022 plan, and we are already starting to think about 2024. I mean, I think that social issues and cultural issues have really revamped where the private sector fits in all of this. And a lot of folks are scrambling to figure out, what are we supposed to do? How do we do it? And that's fine. A lot of companies have sort of been in this space for a while, and they're just sort of reevaluating how they engage. So different companies are at different places. But I think for the foreseeable future, these elections are going to be much more closely watched. Things are changing so quickly. Employees want to know, obviously where their company stands on issues, but they also want to know, when and how they can engage and, be more civically minded as these issues and cultural shifts impact them and their families directly, right? So I think that is what we should be prepared for. Building the infrastructure now to sustain a robust voter education effort in the private sector. I just don't think this is going to reverse itself anytime soon.
Definitely. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, I agree with Kenny. The other two things we've seen are, like Carolyn and Kenny said before, local elections. As voters are paying more attention, they're more excited about the power they have in local elections. And the second thing is civic actions in between elections. After election day and after major events that have happened in the last couple months, people are like, what can I do? And we're starting to see companies providing local actions that people can take. Often they're nonpartisan. Sometimes they could be, advocating for a local elected official to vote a certain way on a bill or volunteer. Certain actions around the issues that matter most to companies. So keeping that engagement, that social impact awareness for folks, evergreen.
Thank you. Last question from me before we get into wrapping up the call. And again, folks who are watching, if you want to type something, please do so now. Sylvia, you and I had talked about this a little bit, but thinking about the folks who are in this panel right now and the folks who are joining the panel, many work in and around government affairs in DC. Probably a lot of them are lawyers. Are there particular and tailored ways that these folks should feel that they might be best placed to get involved?
Sure. I mean, as everybody's spoken, there's so many ways that one can volunteer to engage in elections. You can be a poll worker, which we all think is, I think all of us would say if number one thing is poll worker. But also, we have nonpartisan volunteers at polling locations that help answer voters' questions. There is a nonpartisan hotline staffed by lawyers across the country to assist voters. Those are often depending on, what your legal office looks like, that's often staffed. It's often, a law firm somewhere will just say, okay, we'll answer all the calls from this state. And then they just have like their own little boiler room in their conference room of the law firm, right? So you can definitely engage in ways that doesn't take much, answering phones for a few hours. It doesn't have to be the whole day. You can do a shift, an easy way for an individual to get engaged.
And we have one, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add on Sylvia, because I love that you brought up election protection in that. That's what those of us who work in this space, we call that the election protection hotline and coalition, which Common Cause helps run. Just to know, it is not just answering calls because you're recording the information, and it helps track where things are happening. So we have a record, especially if there are hot spots where we keep seeing repeated issues. So just letting you know, there's even more like in that role. So but awesome that you.
I'm going to turn us to the first question to come in live from the Q&A box. What are considerations that companies should make before embarking on GOTV efforts, and are there reputational risks?
I'll take that, I guess. Yeah, look, I mean, there's a risk to everything. There's a risk to not doing it too, right? So I think that you have to weigh those risks, for your particular company. I'd say for a company like our size, we have a lot of employees and they're all over the country. So, if we didn't engage on these issues, we would, that's another reputational hit, right? So there are reputational risks. And I think that's sort of when I get back to keeping it, for at least for us, educational focused. Everything but the who, that's what I say. How, where, when, everything except who to vote for. And that's sort of how I think about it when thinking about our strategy, because as I sort of mentioned earlier, everything gets politicized. Even the work we do now gets politicized on both sides. So I guess that's how you know you're doing it right, if everyone's criticizing you, right? So there are risks, but I think there are greater risks both internally and externally for not engaging on these issues. So I think it's up to your company. It's up to your company culture. Again, like for us, this is part of our culture. This has been our ethos for a very long time. It's grown and changed over the course of my tenure, but it is definitely a part of the company culture, and it has been even before I was at PepsiCo.
Thank you so much. Looking just quickly at the other side of that reputational risk, someone noted that we talked a lot about the risk of not getting involved, not taking a stance, but would love to hear more about this and how we see civic engagement play a role in this process.
I'm happy to talk about it, but I think Kenny touched on it a little bit. I think just with the youth generations, quite frankly, I mean, those are our future employees and those are our future consumers, right? And these are the largest generations in our country's history. They're the most diverse generation, the most educated, quite frankly, and their access to information. And so what we're going to see is only more of this. And I think that's what Kenny spoke about, is like, that's why we're engaging. And we see like the trend is that we're going to continue and increase, is that I think there's just going to be more and more demand for this. And the reality is that those companies and brands who do engage in it, who do create a space for it, those are going to rise up to the top in the minds of people, of places you want to work, places where you want to spend your money. So that would to me be the risk.
Thank you. One more question here. I think we have time for one more, and then we can wrap things up. Looking at companies that do advocate for partisan issues, how can they engage meaningfully on something like this? I wonder, Alex, if you might answer that, because I know we talked about it.
Yeah, our approach to this has been to make tools to let your employees or consumers take their own meaningful actions. So a big part of the core of what we do and how we think about everything is like, we want actions to be meaningful. We want people to be able to vote confidently and their entire ballot. But also a lot of people have this feeling of like, I don't know what to do about this huge issue. And they want to make those choices for themselves. They don't want to feel like their company is forcing them to do something or not, but they don't know what to do. So that's why we provide local civic actions so that people can make those choices for themselves.
Thank you. Looking at, there's one left here, apologies. What are examples of companies doing this really well? PepsiCo. Definitely. Any others we can think of that we could give a special shout out to?
I mean, I'm proud of all the partners that we worked with. So I think what was really cool to see is just over the last few years, just the increase of companies doing this and also trying things out, because really companies have such a large platform, much larger than any of our organizations have alone, to help innovate in this space and try things out. So that I would say all of the companies really proud of all the work that we've done, being partners, true partners, actually trying to figure this out and trying to actually change the culture about this. So to me, I think any company that's even trying to do this and partnering with an organization to make sure that they're staying they're not making mistakes in the space is doing this well.
It's too hard to choose, except for Pepsi. So.
And I'll just say that, we have a lot of partnerships with smaller local regional businesses as well, or regional offices of certain businesses. And we found that those partnerships have been very successful, and they might not be names that everybody knows, but even just a corner of your world can be great partners.
On that wonderful note, we've come to the end of our 13th Dialogue for Change. Sylvia, Carolyn, Alex, and Kenny, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. Please look for follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about the Dialogue for Change speaker series and for additional diversity, equity, and inclusion resources. You can find us on Twitter at Invariant and also on LinkedIn. Thank you again so much for joining us today.